Hello, everyone. I am joined, and I probably should apologize for this. I am joined by Professor Greg Sadler, Djalma Beorn, ZahnZee, and Victor Magariño to go over this 4-hour monstrosity by James Lindsay on Hegel. Would everybody like to introduce yourselves? Let's go from left to right. Professor, please.
Is that me?
That is you, yes.
Okay. I'm Greg Sadler. I think probably a lot of people know me from my YouTube channel and podcast and various other stuff. I'm guessing I'm here because I do the half-hour Hegel project videos, which is a commentary. It's not that I'm like the expert on Hegel, but I'm the only person who is willing to do the work to create a video commentary on that like that. So yeah, but Lindsay is quite something, isn't he?
That's a good way to put it. Well, you are here because, as far as I am aware, layperson that I am, you're the most competent commentator on Hegel on this platform. And you haven't just done commentary on Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. You've done 30-minute commentaries on, I think, roughly every 5 or so sections of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit.
No, I mean every passage.
Every passage, yeah. So it's So you've practically rewritten the thing. So I think that's probably underselling it a bit to say it's a commentary. And Djalma Beorn, please introduce yourself.
Well, now that you've stolen my thunder in terms of my name, I'm Djalma Beorn. I'm a graduate student in philosophy who works on social metaphysics and pragmatism and also phenomenology a little bit. So I'm here to help Greg because maybe I can have some backup insights on Hegel and help deal with Lindsay. So, hi everyone.
And Zan.
Hello. I'm ZahnZee, Irish Republican Socialist. What I'm probably most well known for is speedrunning. I play games over and over again in steadily decreasing increments of time, and every now and then slip in that Marxism isn't evil while I'm doing it. That's who I am.
Thank you very much. And Victor.
Yes, so my name is Victor Magariño. I hold a degree in philosophy and in economics from NYU. And, I do a lot of commentary on Marxist and classical political economy. Those are the schools that I generally, fall in line with. And, having watched, not the full extent, obviously, but a little bit of this video, I can say already that, we're up for a very nice commentary here. And we're going to be doing something. We are going to be commenting on James Lindsay fighting, Pokemons. And I'm here stealing Gijek's joke. Maybe I'll have time to elaborate later on. But this is basically what we're going to be doing, We're going to be analyzing his Pokemons.
We're going to be putting the sad in Sadler. All right. I'm so sorry. If you leave now, I'll forgive you. You're justified.
Well, I don't, I'm not a sad guy. You notice I'm already laughing about this stuff because I enjoy this quite a bit.
That's good. We're going down with a full tank.
Yeah, exactly. 30 seconds in, we're enjoying this quite a bit. It hasn't even started yet.
All right. Well, without further ado, I'm so sorry. Let's do this. Just let me know if you guys want to stop.
No
I'm just
worries.
leaving that open. I don't care how you want to stop. Just let me know. This is 4 hours long. We're going to set a hard cap at 2 hours. I think, Greg, you have to leave at once. Just let me know. And anybody else who wants to drop off as it goes on, feel free. 3, 2, 1. Audience, let us know if you can actually hear this, because I don't want to get an hour into this and not be audible. Let's go.
Can we stop it right there, like right there?
Yes.
So just from the intro, the term appeared and it's going to be repeated a lot, wokeness, Now, what exactly is wokeness? Is he going to explain to us what he means? Because nobody yet has given a systematized definition of what wokeness is. Wokeness is really a Pokemon, and this is what I was talking about in the beginning, So just to keep that in mind, this is going to be a dialectical analysis of wokeness and all of those things. just for the fun.
Wokeness is a Pokemon. Hold on to that.
Hey everyone, this is James Lindsay. You are listening to the New Discourses podcast.
Hi, Jim.
And finally, after months of anticipation, after many times on Twitter of this blowing up, I want to talk to you about Hegel. I've been promising to talk about the Hegelian idea for a while. I've been tweeting about it. Something peculiar happens every time you tweet about Hegel and you get too close. For example, if you point out that wokeism is a Hegelian religion, especially if you point out that wokeism is a Hermetic religion based in the dialectical philosophy of Hegel.
Can you pause it for 1 second?
Dessert.
Yes.
So just noting about this whole getting too close part, it's like, so Hegel is like this sort of magician that, brings back the woke from the dead and kind of is in line with the Hermetic tradition. And he's something, this is actually kind of a common sentiment in different circles. You just can't get too close to him, because if you understand what he's getting at and you actually try to get into the dialectic instead of looking at someone else's interpretation of it, it won't make sense, but it actually does. So we're going to clear that up. Just noting that getting too close part, a little weird.
I want to say something a little bit here. There is no Hegelian dialectic, and there's different works, and Hegel adopts, rather different methods towards them. Sometimes he does like threes, but we all know there's no thesis, antithesis, synthesis in Hegel as such, even when he's playing around with threes. And I was struck as I was watching the little bits of this that I watched that Lindsay, he says, well, I've been, spending all this time getting ready. Just the Wikipedia article on dialectics, if he had just looked at that, he would know that essentially it's bullshit. And I do want to bring up bullshit in the Frankfurtian sense, because I've been trying to wrap my head around what is this guy actually doing. So I'm going to say something here. It's a little bit long, but and we'll see what the rest of you think about it. I don't follow Lindsay on Twitter. I actually blocked him a while back because I found his tweets so ridiculous, and the tiffs that he was getting into so contrived that I first just I didn't follow him, and then so many people were engaging with him. I was like, I don't want to listen to this guy because it's just too stupid. So I blocked him, and I'm still, of course, getting plenty of stuff surrounding him. So enough that I actually know about what's going on with him. I can't really quite figure out exactly what his shtick is. Because it's, is he just a grifter? Is he just trying to get attention? Is he just not particularly bright and just throws a lot of ideas together in a silly way? Or is he doing what a bullshitter does, with Harry Frankfurt, where the bullshitter tells lies and knows that they're lies, but doesn't care that they're lies. And that's the closest thing that I've come to, pegging him as. And I'm kind of curious what the rest of you make of this guy, because he certainly seems to be like a pesky fly buzzing around that we're stuck with.
One thing that's going to come to the fore, I think, as we start to get into, especially the beginning of this, is that he has, for somebody who is, so categorically sloppy, and underdetermined, he is going to have a strangely, not like an actually fine-grained grasp of sort of the intellectual trajectory of which Hegel is a part, but he's going to have a strangely strong grasp on it, considering how bad he is at this. Okay. So here's what I think. As this video gets more and more schizophrenic, between him giving like a fairly lucid account, if a basic account of something that's legitimate, to, and this is the Hermetic religion of wokeness, I think what we're seeing is Lindsay on the one hand and the ghostwriter who did his actual research on the other. Because I don't think for a second that somebody can produce 4 hours of content on Hegel from research and do this. I don't think it's possible.
I mean, just related to that, and I think that's probably structurally impossible. Greg, I just wanted to maybe suggest a couple of alternate frames or ways we might be able to look at this going forward. I don't have the advantage of engaging with Hegel on any level the way that you do, but I've directly and recently read The Phenomenology of Spirit and can link it into other things on that basis. And even from my extremely limited knowledge, we would probably be better positioned to see Hegel as a relational thinker as opposed to somebody interested in a dialectical kind of, and of course the thesis antithesis shows up nowhere. You're absolutely correct about that. But, Peirce dismissed Hegel as all secondness or all relation at one juncture. And so really what Hegel cares about is the relation between, not the subject and the object per se, but our ability to perceive something and the thing in the world and what that relation actually does and what it generates. And so even as the loosest possible frame, I think seeing him as a relational thinker would be more apt.
Seeing Hegel as one, that makes sense. I mean, I think there is a progress within the phenomenology, but I point this out to my students that what we're getting are like the success stories. We're not getting all the places where the dialectic or the development or the dynamic stalled like it does in most places. Hegel's only interested in following where something leads to something else, but oftentimes it doesn't lead to any sort of synthesis. It leads to a impasse, and then we got to shift. We go from one section to another, or one subsection to another, or we leave something behind.
And yet we can see that impasse almost as sort of relational impasse too. I'm not saying anyway this is the perfect lens. I'm just trying to reorient our audience alongside you away from the previous frame on Hegel.
Yeah, the sort of cookie cutter, right? Yeah. I mean, that's what Lindsay's working with, as far as I can tell, is this very cookie cutter. And it's not clear whether it's supposed to be that Hegel provided people with a method which then they can use for new stuff to figure things out, or whether, Hegel actually doesn't think he's doing that. Hegel thinks that it's all been done and now he's just articulating what's happening. But these sort of, it strikes me. So I know I'm talking a lot here, so I'm going to shut up in a minute.
No, please.
It strikes me that what Lindsay is doing is not, with Hegel, is not that unusual, because there's a lot of really bad history of philosophy or history of idea takes out there, where people have their compartments that they put things into, and there's like the good guys and the bad guys, and one thing leads almost inevitably to another. And if he actually had read Hegel closely and thought about Hegel in history, he would know that that's just not very good, or if he read other philosophers who engage history seriously. There's so much contingency involved. There's so much requirement that we kind of like interpret and react to things in situations that can't be just, a nice, neat recipe. It's almost like he thinks Hegel's a cookbook,
I like that analogy. And just for clarification for the audience, for Djalma's point, when Djalma says that Hegel is relational, and I think we had some from the expert here on that, what is being pointed out is that, like, let's take Kant as an example. You have the subject and you have the object. You can't get at the things in themselves, right? However, Hegel's going to say, well, look, like, there is a thing that is inferring an object that is not the self, and therefore there is an in-between that incorporates both in some respect, or at least touches on both in some respect. And that's where Hegel's focusing on. It's the, what's the actual word? It's the, oh shoot, I just had it.
You mean of relation? Beziehung, right?
What's that, sorry?
Well, you're talking about relation. His term for that is Beziehung,
Yeah,
and I think I don't want to overexpand the importance of the point. It was mainly just like the functioning of self-consciousness, and how it picks out objects in the world, and how it references itself, and how beings in themselves come to exist the way they are. So just was sort of more the method through which the consciousness becomes aware of itself being foundationally relational. And when we look at the truth of anything, and we look at the truth of that in the world, it's a relational truth between the self and the object, and so you can't really say that it rests with either part of that, but rather the sort of movement between the two. So it's sort of a minor point related to freedom of self-consciousness, that sort of thing. So
another way of talking about this in more Hegelian terms is the notion of mediation.
Thank you. That's the word.
And part of what happens like in the phenomenology, for example, right, where anytime that Hegel says immediate, that should be a red flag that goes up, and you'd be like, well, that's not going to stay immediate very long, because he's going to reveal to us, and this is what the phenomenologist does, that things are connected together in much more close relations than we take them as. Nothing is ever just what it presents itself as. It's always in relation to other things, and then we can expand it, and some relations matter more at certain points or with certain things in mind, and others recede into the background. But you never get anything in a Hegelian perspective that's truly immediate or unmediated.
In fact, you have a lovely quote about the grave of the actual, I think, somewhere in Hegel, which I can't remember where exactly that was from, but it kind of elucidates that the second you think you actually have something, it's the memory of that thing. You're moving past it.
All right. So realizing that we've actually given him approximately 5 seconds to speak.
There's one thing very quickly that I do just want to interject on,
Please.
And that it's I know very little about James Lindsay. I see people talk about him an awful lot, but I've never really bothered to investigate him, because anything that I hear him say has either felt like superfluous nonsense, or like there's something in there, but he doesn't care enough himself to actually say what he's thinking, and is relying upon the grandioseness of the tweet to do most of the talking for him. So it's just never felt like something I've cared about. But what really got me into this one was that his decision to call it a hermetic religion was like, my partner is studying a study of religions. So vicariously, because I take an interest in other people's lives, I started going to some of those lectures. And one of the things that I spotted immediately within the study of religions is that 9 times out of 10, very often when people will say X is a religion, they've no fucking clue what they're talking about. Because one of the things that was made very abundantly clear to me within those lectures was that the question, what is a religion, is one of the most hotly debated topics within the field itself. Whether you want to take a sociology of religion, philosophy of religion, anthropology of religion, so many different perspectives. So when he says X is a religion in this regard, what I'm trying to pay attention to is he being descriptive, or is he kind of using it as an ushering concept to kind of bypass that idea and to just like gesture you onto the train so he can take you for a ride, and then you make a lot of the connections for him so he doesn't have to justify his positions. This is one of the things I want to be paying attention to.
Can I make like let's see if I can make a brief point as well, because this entire thing started with Gregory asking, what is this guy really about, and here I have somewhat of a thesis, which is that he belongs to this new tradition of right-wing ideologues like Jordan Peterson, like Ben Shapiro, all of these people who basically are there, whether consciously or not, to build a narrative, to build some kind of ideological lens that they can basically sell to the common people, and sometimes not to so common people, but to the public, let's say, so that they can, in a sense, justify a given set of conditions. Okay, now some of those conditions are imaginary, and some of those conditions are real. Part of the climate change thing, when they start to talk about the real science of climate change, they are indeed, defending a certain set of material interests there, which are those of, obviously, the people that pay them, right? Which are people that are also, highly connected with the oil industry and so on and so forth. So I think that, James Lindsay here belongs to this tradition of people that are here to produce a narrative, an ideological narrative, to sell to the common people, and they are paid, by people who have material interests in this particular ideology being spread around. So I think that this is basically what he belongs to. And that is what I was saying at the beginning, that we're going to be fighting against the Pokemons that he is himself constructing there in his own mind through his own ideological lens, right? He's interacting with the real world, and he's actually going to talk about certain things here that are correct. Okay, and this is one of the parts that I think is completely true, which is that the worst lies are those that are based on true things, right? And he's going to say certain things that are true, but okay, and this is the important thing here, he's going to use the reality, okay, as a means to put inside of reality his own Pokemons, so that we can all, search for them and fight against them. But in reality, those things don't exist. When he talks about the woke being a religion, okay, and this is something that he says a lot, okay, he talks about religion because I think he's one of those like conservative atheists kind of type, or maybe I'm wrong here, but he's, projecting the fact that he knows that religions, produce a certain kind of behavior, a certain kind of mental patterns that are problematic, okay, that stop critical thinking and so on and so forth. And he knows that a lot of his audience also has this information. And basically what he's trying is for the people that watch him to fill in the gaps. He says, this is a religion. And then everyone immediately says, oh yes, in my mind, religions are bad things. Therefore, whatever he's saying is a religion is also a bad thing. So he's just doing, this, what is called a mind-stopping cliche, with this sentence. It doesn't have any content. It's just a mind-stopping cliche.
Just as a final note, he is sort of showing his hand a little bit here because there is a book that was pointed out to me by Glenn McGee called Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition. And I think what's going on here is somebody who's informing him has told him about this thesis in the very abstract, and he's bought his own bullshit. So this book characterizes Hegel as being in some sense related to Hermeticism. That, of course, has like a lot of religious connotations and connections. And so he's gone, oh, Hegel is this woo-woo thing. It's like, and then he's doing exactly what Zahn and Victor say. So let's let the man speak. God help us. Okay, so we are now 25 minutes in, and this is why we are not going through the whole thing, because we are actually just short of 1 minute into the video at this point. And it is 3 hours and 49 minutes long.
You end up, or I end up, at least getting bombed by people in kind of a disproportionate fashion, and something very inorganic begins to happen in many of these cases. Of course, there's the usual making fun of me, but lots of very obviously leftist accounts kind of lose their mind, pop up on my radar, and what will happen is some stuff that's just not quite real, right? Something that's hyper real in a sense, and that'll be that, somebody will throw a dunk, and somebody will, with maybe just a few dozen followers, will reply to something, maybe in dunk fashion, and a reply tweet from an account that's not very big will somehow get hundreds of likes, sometimes in a very small amount of time. It's not organic behavior. There's something weird going on with Hegel. And this has driven me to want to understand more of Hegel. Hegel is, of course, relevant. Everybody who knows much about Marx knows that Hegel is relevant to Marx. And I want to make the case that Hegel is relevant to what's going on. And in fact, that we can understand the woke ideology or woke worldview is a better way to put it. The worldview of critical social justice, also known as theory, as a Hegelian faith. And so to begin, this is probably going to go pretty long because I want to do this in depth. I want to get it all there. I have copious notes for this. I want to just read to you something that might not stick out to you otherwise from Critical Race Theory and Introduction. This is by Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanczyk. It's a typical fundamental textbook in critical race theory, and I've quoted from it about a bajillion times. So I just want to read to you this paragraph.
By the way, this book has been quoted a bajillion times by all of these people, and I think it's because it's the one book that you can Google critical race theory readers and buy it off Amazon. And what's bizarre is that the quote he's going to give is actually super reasonable. It's not crazy.
In the section about essentialism and anti-essentialism, they write, some observers hold that all minority races should compromise their differences and form a united front against racism in general. The danger in this essentialized approach is that certain minority groups, socioeconomic classes, and sexual orientations may end up better off and others worse. Recall how shabbily black women were treated in the civil rights movement of the 1960s, rarely allowed to speak for the group, made to march in the second row, and relegated with a few exceptions to support roles. It has only been relatively recently that black women and Latinas have emerged as powerful voices on the American scene. Perhaps the essentialism/anti-essentialism debate sets in when mainstream thought is beginning to see the validity in the larger group's complaints. Like an automobile with deferred maintenance, smaller subgroups that have until then remained silent begin bringing suppressed issues to the larger group's attention. And so the dialectic progresses. That's the end of the quote.
The only relevance is that he says the word dialectic.
Yeah, I mean, so he's discovered intersectionality. That's great, That's the
I
thing.
was gonna say that it's actually, I find it deeply insulting when people take two legitimate traditions that don't necessarily or need to overlap them and kind of defeat what's important or relevant about both traditions in the process,
Yeah.
right? So obviously you look at intersectionality on Crenshaw's view or anything like that. It's not just that you get into a car crash and intersection where on the one hand you have one form of oppression and on the other hand you have the other. It's that at the point at which those two cars meet or the impact occurs, a new identity with a new structural position informed by new social factors emerges. And so there's complexity there. And, the dialectic is not something that was promoted or included in Hegel's thought or in his phenomenology. And this dialectic isn't proper in the way that it's being portrayed by Lindsay there, isn't really descriptive of what's going on in critical race theories, that kind of studies either. So it's this thin linking term that is unjust to basically both traditions. So I find that quite frustrating. But, yeah.
And I think we all understand what he's doing here in particular. Is he's saying, look, here's this left-wing thing. We're not going to mention any, like we're mentioning specifically Black people and Latino people and whatnot. And look, they're infighting, and the dialectic continues. The left eats its own. But really, what he's describing here is actually, hey, this is a community that could be benefited by, introspection and inner dialogue. All the stuff they say that the left and the universities are adamantly against. It's really bizarre. And again, like there's as you say, there's no connection whatsoever to Hegel here. It's just it mentions stuff that vaguely seems left wing, and then dialectic.
I mean, this project is really, really pointless, right? Because what he's trying to do there is he's trying to explain this concept that he has of the woke by looking at Hegel, which are things that are completely unrelated, or maybe you can find a point here and there, but that are fundamentally, not related to each other. And then he's trying to say you can understand these modern boogeymans of the right by looking at Hegel. And a poor interpretation of Hegel as well, because this is not going to be, a very solid understanding of Hegel either. Because, there are cultural critics, for example, like Zizek, who have read a lot of Hegel, and they can indeed make certain statements about today's world and about, philosophical traditions here and there. But this person is clearly not doing this, okay? So this project is already, doomed from the very start.
It's interesting. Later on in the video, he's going to say Hegel came up with the term dialectic or something like that, right? Which again, lack of research.
Oh my God!
Because somebody else who uses the term and actually tried to give it some sort of characterization was Aristotle. And this whole infighting among the left thing, you don't have to go to Hegel for understanding that. You could actually kick it all the way back to thinking about Aristotle's politics, rhetoric topics, and talk about, the dynamics that Aristotle looks at, class dynamics primarily between the rich who typically want to, rule over everybody else, and the many who are free. And Aristotle says, well, they're both kind of right, but both, get things wrong, and they each have legitimate concerns to bring forward. This is like normal politics, right? And you could do it in terms of race, and you can do it in terms of class, and you can do it in terms of gender, and you can do all these at the same time. That's kind of like normal stuff. Now, is that necessarily dialectical in an Aristotelian sense? I mean, Aristotle says that dialectic is what happens when we go, it's actually very closely related to rhetoric, right? He says this in the very first line of the rhetoric, that it's how you're using what he calls the endoxa, the things that most people believe or buy into, right? And we're not trying to be scientific with it. We're we're arguing with each other and saying, hey, what about this? Or you overlooked my concern over here. So, what he's describing there using this passage is actually much more like what, and we could pick all sorts of other theorists if we wanted to. There's nothing Hegelian about it. It could be understood in an Aristotelian way. We could take Hannah Arendt to understand it. This is just basic politics, right?
And what's strange is that later on still, sorry, just to jump in there quickly, later on still, he's going to then go back on that and say, yes, I'm aware this exists in these other thinkers. Again,
Okay.
it's schizophrenic. And it's as you say, I don't think he cares that what he's saying is untrue. It's just whatever serves the sentence in the moment. Sorry, Djalma.
So related to that too, I think that even characterizing the discussion or debate in left-leaning circles as essentialist versus anti-essentialist, or constructionism is somehow, diametrically opposed to essentialism, or not being interested in metaphysics at all, or not having, or talking about things as being somewhat arbitrary as opposed to real, is also just a false set of distinctions, right? It's about what types of questions people want to ask, they believe are relevant for what groups. And if anything, a lot of stuff in feminist epistemology has been about increasing descriptive detail and nuance in a way that makes people as meta-aware of their biases and values going into that process as possible, not so much juxtaposing, ideologically reified views, things that are essentialist and then anti-essentialist, aka constructionist, pitted against each other for the sake of it. And so, again, I think that the way that loops in notions of essentialism is also a dangerous part of that mischaracterization as well, potentially. So.
It's one thing I also want to point out is that it sounds like he's trying to take a shot at the concept of critical theory in its totality, but then hyper-focusing on kind of like the invocation of social class to point out how there is discrepancies in specific interests amongst those social classes. And just to give an example of me rewording the passage he talked about to kind of take it outside of that social class, as a sociologist would describe it, to take it into a more economic class. If you go back to 1916, so I'll just say one thing very quickly. As I understand it, what the passage is essentially saying is that universal interests cannot be thought of as common interests, because common interests are independent of specific interests. A universal interest, as it can be decided, is basically a hegemonic interest, and it's whoever has power in a situation determines what that universal interest can be. And to give an example, as I see it, if you go back to 1916 to take it outside of social class, you had an Irish Marxist syndicalist called James Connolly who took part in a Republican rising, and Irish capitalists were calling for his execution by the British forces. And the reason they had an issue with this was because he was a trade unionist. So their interests were completely at odds with each other, where you had Irish Republican landowners calling for the execution of a revolutionary by the people that they were trying to get independence from, because their interests aligned based on that hegemonic position of capitalism, where they had a shared interest that they passed off as a universal interest.
Interesting. Okay, I'm going to set a rule here. He gets to talk for 5 minutes before we respond. Although we're doing good. We're at almost 4 minutes in.
Yeah.
But let's check that last part. And so the dialectic progresses. That word, dialectic, is not there by mistake. Neither is the idea that's put forth with the dialectic that it's progressing. And in fact, neither is the idea that it's progressing into a smaller and more niche area. So what the argument here is that they're making in this last sentence is that as larger scale problems seem to be getting sorted out, smaller scale problems get brought up to the fore and have to be worked out as well. And so the dialectic progresses. None of this is there by mistake. So in this episode of the podcast, I want to convince you of two primary things. They're going to be kind of my North Star, I suppose, in communicating this stuff to you. One, this idea of dialectic is important. In fact, it is the operating system of leftists, and it has been for almost 200 years. It's so important that if you don't understand this seemingly quirky word and where it comes from philosophically, you don't have the slightest idea of what's going on in leftist politics.
We agreed?
I mean, you need to go back to Plato to understand dialectics. So
yeah, I think the
is
concept
he
is
going back to
important.
Plato?
All right, I broke my own rules. Keep going.
Secondly, this dialectic is a method of worship in a broad religious movement that started primarily with Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel in the early 19th century. A Phenomenology of Spirit in 1807 is probably a good bookmark to say when this started. So we're looking at 214 years since the publication of that book. His later writings extend into the late 1820s. So we're looking at roughly 200 years ago. That broad Hegelian religion has denominations that include Marxism, neo-Marxism, also known as critical theory or cultural Marxism, Fabianism, and wokeness. So I want to convince you of these two things.
Whoa.
Dialect.
Look,
So we know that
No.
neo-Marxism is a religion that springs from the Hegelian religion. You know, this is what we've learned so far.
oh,
Okay,
even
and
worse, it's a
religions have denominations.
Yeah, it's a denomination. Even worse, it's like derivative. It's a you could go up a level and get the Hegelian Hermetic religion from it. In fact, like this is so misleading. It's disturbing.
Well, I mean,
so
it's kind of bizarre. He's deriving categories from connotations in the word he has arbitrarily used to describe the thing. So, like he might be ascribing things to Hegel now based on the etymology of the word religion. Like it's
okay. So does materialism respond to idealism? Absolutely. But that is a completely different process than something being a denomination or subset of another thing or carrying forward some weird telos of the previous thing. This is like he's creating a straw man that has nothing to do with Hegel, like his Pokemons and everything, right? And then in addition to that, he's then messing up his own straw man. That's the problem. So now he's getting lost in the weeds of his own false argument. This is what we're probably going to see as this goes from here, right?
It's hard to see how somebody could get things that wrong without kind of deliberately doing so, or essentially being caught up in their own, craziness in their head. It's sort of like Chesterton's guy, insane person in Orthodoxy that he describes, the madman who he has a world that's very consistent. It just doesn't map onto the rest of the world, and in this case, it doesn't map onto what we know about the complexities of the history of ideas and how they connect with people's lives and things like that. So it's an interesting story, but it's, here's something changing topic a little bit. I was, as I was approaching this, I was thinking, could you actually make sense out of what Lindsay's doing from a Hegelian perspective? Like say, where he fits in the dialectic, how ideas. So, President Sunday mentioned a schizophrenia involved here. I mean, Hegel would call that contradiction, Widerspruch, which often gets translated, by the way, as antithesis in the Miller, but, that isn't really the right way to translate Widerspruch. And so it seems like Lindsay has lots of contradictions going on here, And then from a Hegelian perspective, you would say, okay, what's going on with this stuff? Is it just Irrtum insanity, like in the skepticism section of self-consciousness? Is this just making the world burn kind of stuff, or is there something else going on here? And I think Victor's right that this is done essentially so he can have something that he can mobilize against people.
Greg, can I ask you a question related to that?
Yeah,
I actually
absolutely.
just want to clarify something because obviously having, been through this a few times on my own and being able to contextualize it, I've got a little bit of a sense of an area that might link into this, but I just want to know what you think of this and feel free to shoot me down entirely. So the section in the Phenomenology of Spirit on lordship and bondage, right? Mm-hmm. Where we talk about the emergence. This is often where people end up getting Hegel wrong or assuming that there is a dialectic or that somehow that's the most central aspect of his thinking. Yeah. But where the bondsman develops a kind of double consciousness that's not available to the Lord. And the reason is because the Lord is presented with a world. And in this sense, it's more of a skeptic's move in terms of being caught in his own head. But in this sense, the Lord is presented with a world that completely basically adheres to his own conscious understanding without resisting it and without creating any challenge to it. And so this is kind of like the danger of things like echo chambers or there's those sorts of things where via his social position, because this is a bit of a false analogy because there's no way in which this person is in a powerful social position per se, but it's rather that he's extending his consciousness out into the world in a way that's irresponsible and fails to take other people as things outside of objects of his consciousness, right? Loses out on that being in the world, loses out on the opportunity to exist in the world as a person in Hegel's
Yeah.
sense. So that's really might be what's going on here from what I read. And I don't know if that's accurate or not, but that really struck me.
What I really do like about that, and I'm a person who often says, master-slave dialectic, not that important compared to what else is going on in it. But what I do like about that analogizing there is there's some other aspects of the master-slave section that are really relevant to what the master is getting away with. One is that they're motivated by their desire, and their desire is for consumption, for engagement. And that's what people do in echo chambers. They consume each other's bullshit, and they regurgitate it back and forth, and it's fun. And they some of them say, I do this because I have a sense of camaraderie here. I feel like I fit in. This is, just for the laughs or stuff like that. So I think that's definitely part of it. And then, the other thing that the master wants and can't get sufficiently from the slave, and I guess you could say Lindsay is kind of stumbling around in this, is recognition. On-air canon, right? Acknowledgement. And Lindsay would love for people to say that he's a smart guy, and that he's actually on top of stuff. I don't know him that well, but that's very clearly coming through his stuff that I've seen so far. And I think that's you can say that doesn't just happen, of course, in the lordship bondage, master slave thing. That's running throughout the entire spirit section, a lot of the reason section. People are looking for this reciprocal acknowledgement, and it's in a lot of ways they want to have it both ways. So Lindsay wants to be the big shot intellectual who is diagnosing the cultural problems of our age and stuff like that, and maybe make a buck while he's doing it too, and have people cheer him on and all that sort of stuff. And then as soon as he encounters any real opposition, he's all over the map, because he doesn't really have the stuff, and he's so desperately needy for that, right? And I would say that a lot of the people who buy into a Lindsay, or Victor brought up Jordan Peterson, or people like that, the people who are desperate not just for they're desperate for some answers about things that seem to cover things, but they're also desperate to be recognized, and they do it sort of vicariously, in this case through the figure of the Lord, right?
Right. And I think that and I agree with you, it works through the entire dialectic, not just, or God, no, not that word. It works through the entire phenomenology, not just the lordship and bondage section. You see, that's in the back of my mind. But I think it goes even deeper than that for Hegel, potentially, too. And I certainly agree with what you're saying.
Hey, Djalma, try to keep it's the snowball. Try to keep a consistent distance from it. Otherwise, it stops detecting your voice. Yeah, it's okay.
Oh, no. Okay. Is it detecting it consistently?
You were good so far. It was on edge at points.
Oh, perfect. Okay. And so I think that there's also a more insidious element of this too, which is that when the idea of the self-consciousness, right? I know I'm overly narrowly focused on this, but when it's faced by the other self-consciousness, it's in that moment that it's able to come out of itself, right? So that it finds itself in the other being. And in doing so is able to kind of see, as Hegel's talking about, the other as an essential, and not as an essential being outside of itself, but its own self through the other being. And so that's what I mean really by the mediation or the relationality in Hegel. It's that what's being lost in these echo chambers, as you really were eloquently talking about, is the ability to even come out of oneself to become a proper being at all through finding oneself in the other, right? In that process. It's kind of scary, actually, because that would be where real interchange and development and psychosocial and intellectual development would occur for Hegel, right?
Yeah. And actually, I mean, that's a good point. We have so many echo chambers that were generated in recent years and kind of reinforced through social media, which is a new phenomenon for us. And I think there's a whole generation that we're older, so we've seen these develop. They're walking right into them, and it's part of their formation. They're enculturation, you could say, the Bildung.
Yeah, it puts a burden on them that's unfair, I think.
Yeah, I mean, maybe part of what we have to do is way out of this video thing, but maybe we have to, as educators, be more attentive to how we can get them to come out of these echo chambers a bit better, out of the comfortable spaces, into places where they actually do have to engage others.
Mhm.
And a part of that will be insisting on never identifying the tremendous cosmic irony in having to do that.
I just went to the bathroom 2 seconds.
No worries. Just mute him so we don't hear flushing. All right, let's go.
Is the operating system of leftism, and that leftism that's operating dialectically is in fact a religion that can be traced back to the metaphysics of Hegel. That's a tall order, but I think it's crucial if you want to understand what's going on with the woke, why it appears to be religious, why it has many of the features that it does. If you want to be able to anticipate the moves that it makes, if you want to be able to counter it, you have to understand it. The Polish proverb is never attempt to cure that which you don't understand. So I want to make sure we understand that leftism, in particular, this kind of radical leftism, that line of Marxism, neo-Marxism, Fabianism, wokeness that have really characterized leftism over the past 200 years, or at least 150
really
years.
hard. He's trying really hard to understand his own mental constructs, you know? It's almost like an exercise of introspection. It's all of these things that I invented in my own head. What are they exactly, you know?
Yeah.
Marxism, I guess. Those are all species within a broader, or denominations within a broader religious movement that relies upon the dialectical approach laid out first in significance by Hegel. So the rough picture I want to paint, we could go back. The dialectic really finds its first expression in Kant. We're not going to talk about Kant. It was developed further by Fichte. We're also not going to talk about Fichte. And there Hegel picks up the story. So we're going to start with Hegel. If you want to know more about those other things, you can talk to my friend Stephen Hicks, or you can listen to a read.
So that's a good place. Very interesting, right? Because Hicks has, and I know Hicks actually. I've been invited by him, in the past. I think before he knew what I thought of his book to speak at his institute about Stoicism. His book on postmodernism is very popular, but it's like the root of so much terrible reads on things, So it's interesting to see. This is like a nice connection with Peterson, right? They both rely uncritically on this. How to call it? It's a money making hack job on modernity and postmodernity.
Yeah.
So here's what kind of scares me about this too, is that it prevents students or people writ large from being receptive to things in the history of philosophy or in other disciplines that have to do with things like idealism or materialism or phenomenology. Yeah. It predisposes them away from seeing these things. And I don't like to use the descriptive categorical distinction too much because I know there's some problems with that, but it predisposes them away from seeing things in descriptive terms as things they can learn about that can be applied out in a variety of ways. Given that there's a sense that these things are being kind of used in bad faith to further specific agendas. And then the problem we have too is an issue of access, right? It's great that education and resources have never been more accessible to people than at this juncture, but there needs to be an ability to kind of mediate or interpret what's actually available and what's out there. And so you can have as much information as you could possibly get your hands on and still not know and need guidance as anybody does, no matter how bright they are. And often the more bright they are, the more guidance they need at navigating that information. So we have this, how do I describe it? It's like it's almost like we've glorified data or information as a type of or we value things that are epistemic above things that are moral or things that involve careful interpretation or things like that. And so we just think that the more information that we put out there, regardless of the source or the quality or who's interfacing with it, the better educated, the better able people will be, and people can kind of pick and choose that in an almost kind of consumerist fashion. So
I've learned a little tip when you're trying to ascertain like the value of a general like survey on philosophy from any publisher. If they miss either key figures or if they misrepresent a key person in any particular way, and then they cite Ayn Rand in the index, you basically know exactly what you're getting. It's a weird tendency. Like Hicks basically reproduces every prejudice that Ayn Rand fills the virtue of selfishness with, almost to a T. You can also see that in Urim Hazoni. Like it's actually kind of uncanny. These people are all reading the same books and only responding to each other, and then coming out slandering, as he says himself, hundreds of years old schools of thought, like immensely complicated ways of philosophizing and thinking, and like these long, complex arguments between experts, slandering them, telling people, no, don't bother with these. This is just religious hokum. Yeah. But the left is where the echo chamber is. It's like, I mean, even again, to go back to that quote from the critical race theory reader, what he was describing was advocacy for dialogue between members of a group, yet he's going to posture as an individualist elsewhere. Anyways. Oh, they're on to us.
Read his book. I listened to it, so I automatically went to the audiobook explaining postmodernism. He has some of the relevance of Hegel and Fichte and a number of other thinkers that led up to before Hegel, but I'm going to begin with Hegel. And so what happened is that Hegel eventually died, but a movement, he was really an intellectual rock star at the time where he was in Germany, and a movement arose around him, or actually a few movements arose around him.
Just to stop it right there quickly, I think that's actually factually incorrect. Wasn't he basically despised by the time he wrote The Philosophy of Right because he was seen as basically shilling for the state? Because a bunch of his contemporaries were being arrested and whatnot because he was expressing seemingly, or they were expressing pro-revolutionary sentiments in Germany. Am I out to lunch on that?
I wouldn't say that it's like universally. There, he was held in high esteem. I mean, he certainly still had a lot of students, and he was able to bring out a second edition of the Phenomenology. He also, paved the way for other people, like, for example, Schopenhauer, who then wrote terrible things about him to get a job. So he had juice, so to speak. He hadn't been just eclipsed. And then, Lindsay's going to talk a little bit later about the old and new Hegelians. You don't have, after your death, untimely of cholera, you don't have, Ians or Ists or anything like that debating about your legacy unless you're still, a pretty important figure, I think. So...
Well, it's funny that you point that out, that he, again, like his untimely death, he was apparently one lecture into his last phenomenology, or no, Philosophy of Right series of lectures. Imagine you get into a class with Hegel, and then he dies after the first lecture.
Yeah, that's pretty awful.
I could be completely off base, but one thing that I found interesting is that it's almost like he's describing him like a preacher. And I'm getting at the idea that he's describing this as a religion, where it feels like he's setting Hegel up as kind of being, I can't think of the term for it, but like the person who descended from high to bring forth like the tablet of wokeness, so that we, the followers, can take it into the world with us.
Like a prophet.
Or the intercessor, yeah.
And to borrow from one of the perspectives that I get within Emile Durkheim's perspective of what can be important to categorizing a religion is a conscious delineation and distinction between the sacred and the profane. And it sounds like he was trying to argue that Hegel was considered so as to carry with it a form of charismatic legitimacy, almost in a way to kind of like prime the idea that he's important. Why? Well, look at how people worship him, but never actually argues that people worship him. It's interesting to me because I'm paying attention to the religion perspective he's trying to instill here.
It's funny too, because if you look at what Hegel actually has to say about religion, right? He's got lectures on the philosophy of religion. It figures in other works. There's an entire religion section, which is the penultimate section in the Phenomenology. I think, and this is kind of a mainstream view, that Feuerbach essentially captured what Hegel was about when it comes to religion. Humanity is the religious object par excellence. We've been, projecting gods outside of ourselves and then worshiping them, and all that sort of stuff. And that seems, if you were going to criticize Hegelian religion, that seems like what you'd want to put on the plate. But I don't see Lindsay even cognizant of that.
Zan, can I just ask you a question related to what you just said and what Greg just noted and Feuerbach and all that I thought was kind of interesting about how we're the proper object of religion and how we can kind of manipulate the transcendental and stuff. I know you do, I don't know a tremendous amount about what you do in relation to this in particular, Zane, but I'm thinking about your discussion of how people will often use propaganda or often use, like, especially in, like, I'm not trying to draw a link between this and any kind of extremism, but just the way that propagandistic rhetoric and framing often evokes the transcendental in this kind of common folkish way to create kind of a false history. Do you see anything similar going on here? Do you think that's a bad link to be drawing? I'm just kind of interested in how you think this is working on an ideological kind of propaganda level right now, invoking this sort of religion and hermetics and that sort of thing.
It's something definitely worth thinking about, but we are only 2 minutes in, so I'm not entirely sure. Okay. I don't want to say you're wrong, but I haven't seen anything to say you're wrong. It's well worth taking forward. I'd need to think about it, given more from what he's saying, but it is in line with what I'm worried he's doing, which is constructing kind of like a false mythology around Hegel so as to argue that he's kind of like a messiah figure. So it feels propagandistic, but I can't say it's propagandistic.
Sure.
I will say this, one can like rail against religion and misrepresent things as religion, which has been done in a lot of ways. From an atheistic perspective, one can equally do so from a distorted, Christian perspective, or pick whatever else that you want, where like, well, we've got the one true religion here, and then we've got these other things that are like religions, and those are devilish or dangerous or something, because they're missing the essence of the true religion. And Lindsay's connected up with some Christian fundamentalists, so I think this might be a way to try. That's kind of a common rhetorical move among them, and I think maybe that's part of what's going on too in calling this a religion.
Well, he runs with Peter Boghossian, who, as well as the so-called the aping the so-called affair thing that he did. He also wrote a manual for creating atheists, which even among people in the street epistemologists scene is a little bit, sorry, Victor.
Yeah, I mean, like, we need to understand that the level at which this person is operating is that of everything I don't like is a religion. Religions are bad, therefore everything I don't like is bad. This is the level at which he's operating at. And this is good. And I think that Gregory here had a point, because he's appealing both at the more atheist side of the right, the everything I don't like is a religion, and also at the Christian fundamentalist side of the right, which says all of religions that are not mine are bad. So he's doing, but this is the level of argumentation at which we are at,
What's a little frustrating?
Your religious glue.
Yeah. What's a little frustrating is, like, if he wanted to say, like, there's a lot of undue mystique about Hegel, and he's misused a lot and stuff like that, and his language is deployed in an inscrutable way by a lot of people to put forward propositions that don't hold up under scrutiny, he'd have a point. People do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nobody. I've said before, like, nobody reads Hegel for his style.
Oh God. He's practically unreadable. It's the hardest thing I've ever read in my life.
I mean, I wouldn't say that. I mean, Adorno is more unreadable than Hegel, I think. But
God's new bar.
Yeah, I mean, Hegel's just a bad writer. There's quite a few things where you go through it a number of times, and you can figure out what he's saying. Sometimes you're like, well, he's wrong about that. Or this, I don't know why the hell he says this is necessary when it's not necessary. But he's not unintelligible, but he's just not a good writer.
He requires like an immensely strong memory to follow on a first read. I think it's not that he's a bad writer.
I don't think you can get it on a first read, frankly. That's the thing.
I will agree with that.
So, Greg, I offered about whether or not he's a bad writer, and the fact that you have just affirmed this has made me feel so much better, because that was my suspicion all along.
That's totally off topic, right? But one of the things that happens a lot in my interactions with people who are reading philosophical works is they feel bad because they don't get it, right? And I'll say, well, I mean, any philosophical work, you're not going to get more than half of what's going on in there if you're lucky the first time you read it. And with some, if it's particularly difficult, or they're not a good writer, or they're not very clear, you might only get 10% of what's going on. That's not because you're dumb or don't have the right connections. It's just natural to how these things work, because I think a lot of people feel bad, and they don't have to feel bad.
And I feel like even if you're supposed to get it, and even if you're teaching it and you see like there's an inconsistency in it, or there's a way in which it really is muddled or stated unclearly, you have to kind of get the chutzpah to be like, all right, this is not well stated. This is, I can affirm this. Like, you sort of have to like pump yourself up a bit, right, when you're at that junior stage of teaching.
I will say this, a little bit of a revelation that it's not a totally new one. I've said this elsewhere. So these half-hour Hegel videos that I've been doing for the last 6 years, right? I get up in front of this chalkboard, I put stuff on the chalkboard, and I use that camera that's right there. And, I've gone through like rereading a section, and I've been reading Hegel now for 25 years. So I should, have a pretty good sense of what's going on, particularly in this book. I mean, if you're asking me about the logic or something, okay, I'm not that good at that. I'll have days where I put the stuff on the chalkboard, and I get that tripod back there set up, and I'm ready to film, and I'm dressed up, and I realize can't do it today. I just can't wrap my head around what the hell's going on in this passage in such ways I could explain it to somebody. And then, the next day, usually it's okay. But if that happens to me, it's natural that like anybody reading Hegel would be like, what the hell is this crap? So,
absolutely.
That being said, I will. It's like weightlifting. I find if you read Hegel and you like, the best I can muster is like 10 pages a day, maybe.
Yeah,
and that's on a good day. But once you read Hegel, everything else is so much easier. It's like, you're reading Kant. It's like cutting through butter.
What this is actually screaming at me is that I'm like 10 years ago, I studied how to be a chef. And when looking at kind of like anatomy, what this is screaming at me is there's a perfect food analogy for philosophy right now in terms of like the digestive system. It starts off with mastication and then it goes on to digestion. Neither of these processes is actually absorbing the food. It's breaking it the fuck down. You're about 6 hours into the actual process of consuming food before your body starts taking in the nutrients. And a first read is you breaking it down for a comprehensive ingestion, but you haven't actually started to take in the information. You're just breaking it down into chunks so that you can begin processing it. And I think people reading something for the first time and then throwing it away saying, fuck, I can't get this, is kind of like putting food in your mouth and then spitting it out and thinking, I get no energy out of this.
Well, I think it's important, too, to be approaching text uniquely and with as few preconceived reference points as possible, because it's so easy if you're in one line of research and you're kind of digging back to see, you can trace Hegel through any number of thinkers, but if you're digging back through a specific, let's say, I don't know, pragmatist lens, you're comparing his idealism to Berkeley or something, or working on that, going in not with those preconceived notions is also really, really tough. And so when you actually go in and try to like take it on face value in almost kind of a close reading way, that kind of trains you up to like work through that process of like, all right, I'm going to digest this, I'm going to work on it, blah, blah. Because I think the other problem too is that it's so hard to take texts as what they are, even if they are responding to other things, even if they do belong to a long contextual history going back to Aristotle. It's just you want to take them as what they are. And when you do that too, it can be very, very excruciating as well, right? Because you don't have the comfort of those reference points, right? So that's one strategy I found, just kind of muscle through it a little bit, but it's gruesome.
there's a lot of choice lines that ZahnZee's point brought to mind from Zizek's The Sublime Object of Ideology that I realize I'm not going to quote from.
I love Zizek, but I haven't read a sentence of his work. It's on my list.
Okay, well, if you want a 30-page expose on Hegelian shitting, look at the preface to the aforementioned. Let's get going.
His systematic philosophy, and the progressive one of these was known as the Young Hegelian movement. The Young Hegelian movement is what inspired Marx, and Marxism became the definition of basically everything leftism following Marx, but especially following the success of the Russian Revolution, foisted by Lenin. It also gave rise to neo-Marxism and approximately, in a kind of odd and broken way, postmodernism. And of course, my thesis in Cynical Theories, which I wrote with Helen Pluckrose, is that neo-Marxism and postmodernism fuse with a few other things that were going on to form what we now call woke. So we have this line, Hegel to the Young Hegelian movement, to Marx via Feuerbach, to neo-Marxism, and to some degree postmodernism in sort of a broken way, to woke.
What's neo-Marxism? Is that just like revisionism?
It's the postmodern. It's the postmodern SJW neo-Marxists, Greg. We know who they are. They're there.
Yeah, I'm hazy on like, so if there's like, are there old Marxists still around? And then there's also neo-Marxists. I haven't read, Cynical Theories.
If you want my God's honest opinion, I think it's because they know there's a concept of a neo-Nazi, and Marxists were around during the Nazis, so they're neo-Marxists. I honestly think that's what it is. It's just it's
what happens here is
so it's a rhetorical move. Huh?
No. See, this is all part of the great conspiracy of the Nazis themselves, who actually invented this term of neo-Marxism. Of course, they were leftists. But like all of these things about the neo-Marxism, Bolshevism, all of these things, okay, are part of Nazi propaganda that is, in a sense, recycled in today's American right, and that is actually being brought back to Europe. Because even here in Spain, we have a lot of talks today about neo-Marxism and all of that, which come directly, and they are exactly the same as the thesis of neo-Marxism of the new American right, which is taken from the Nazis. And this is what they say, okay, is anyone that says, for example, gay people exist and they should be respected, that is a neo-Marxist. So
that's what I was going to say.
The level.
It's almost like they're taking that rhetoric, but the jab or the kind of like the sassy repartee from the right is that, oh no, like this isn't proper materialism. This is some kind of weird, quotes, SJW rhetoric or some kind of pluralistic obsession with minority identities that's really just liberalism, LARPing as Marxism, basically.
Now, somebody pointed out in the chat that he's probably referring to the Frankfurt School. The problem here is that he is going to waffle between referring to the Frankfurt School and referring again to, something as amorphous and undefined as when you see people in Fox News talk about liberals. It's like, who's a liberal? Well, I mean, you may as well just use a slur at that point. It has no content.
And I also just want to draw attention to one thing Lindsay is doing that I think is quite deceptive, is he's drawing kind of like a linear path from like, you have Hegel, then you have Marx, then you have the left, when he's completely ignoring the fact that Marx emerged in a contemporary left where you had the distinction, especially between anarchists and communists at the time, where Marx was advocating a particular position and distinction. So like to argue that like Marx underpins most of the left, he doesn't. There was a huge split. That like you can see it in like the outcome of part of that split within the revolution of the Bolshevik Revolution was the Frankfurt School, where they basically said that Marxism has kind of failed in that perspective, so we need to reimagine it along the lines of I can't remember off the top of my head, but like there is no unified position that he's presenting. But I'm also noticing how he's contradicting the idea that there's this constant infighting critical to the dialectic. So there is a dialectic, but there isn't, according to Lindsay right now.
I wonder if we'll actually get to him describing the dialectic.
Here's where I should bow out to, actually. So,
no worries. You've been here for an hour, so yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Sadler.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
You're welcome back anytime. You're welcome back for the next episode of this apparently 30 episode series on this one stream whenever you like. I think we'll probably go for it. Hey, you want to know something? People complained in my video response to this that I didn't go far enough into his stream. So,
Was it the sort of thing like where, well, you don't really know because you didn't like go far enough, like what people do with Peterson stuff, where they're like, if you haven't watched all the videos, who are you to criticize?
well, here's the thing. Like as
that,
we've seen, like his methodology is so fraught, it doesn't actually matter because there's actually nothing to build off of here. We've cut his legs out from Go. Like, what is he going to defend at this stage? And like it's a schizophrenic video. He'll waffle between here's a lucid description of like these people in their historical context, how they related to, again, like in very basic terms, but like this person influenced this person, yada yada yada.
Mhm.
And this is how we know. And this is where the dialectic in the Hermetic religion of wokeness comes from. It's like there's no logical progression from one sentence to the next. It's multiple people talking in a script and him just throwing it against the wall to produce this 4-hour-long monstrosity.
But what I think we did, which was great, though, was we used the beginnings of that as a jumping off point to have what was just a really rich, interesting conversation from like a Marxist perspective. And, obviously with your expertise, Professor Sadler, like it worked out really well, except we didn't really get into the actual discussion of what happens later on. But even just taking apart some of the initial framing turned into a really fruitful discussion, I think. So
I'm kind of jealous you get to bow out.
Well, I mean, you could have technical difficulties, right? That's the way to.
No, I'm Irish. I don't know how to be happy.
I would like to stick around more, but I have other work I have to get done I'm teaching summer classes. So
but Professor, seriously, if you want to continue this, or again, you're always welcome back.
Sounds great.
It's a pleasure to speak to you, Professor Sadler.
Yeah, it was great to meet all of you. I really enjoyed this. Do I hit leave studio then, or?
Yeah, you can absolutely do that. I can just remove you too if you like, if that's easier. But yeah,
All right.
however you like.
I'll say goodbye to everybody.
Like who has to hang up?
The left infighting again. We just kicked our own.
The real Hermetic religion was the friends you made along the way. Okay.
Oh.
Let's keep going. Hey, at least we're bigger now.
Just tanked the same.
And we have this long thread,
and not just from COVID,
of this one religion that's taking different denominational forms as it's going through time. You could say that the woke are, in some sense, you could say that, in fact, in some odd sense, the neo-Marxists are almost like it's Calvinists, or even the woke are like it's Puritans. If you read something like Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, and you're aware of what a Puritan confessional tract looks like, where they're going through their humiliation after they believe that they've been saved.
But this is the thing, that he's pointing to real things in the world. He's operating at a certain level of reality, but then he's injecting all of those, Pokemons so that he can go and catch them alongside his buddies, And this is the real problem of this video and in general of the ideology that they're trying to spread, right? Is that they are operating at a certain level of reality, because it's true, okay, that there is, I think, Robin DiAngelo, who produces all of these books and lectures, saying some things that are completely, either untrue or dangerous. And then he's going to say, and this is the woke. Okay, and then he's going to pinpoint anyone in any given thing, and then he's going to say, okay, this is the woke as well, this is the woke as well. And his example of the woke is just, an isolated case scenario of a person that is, like a corporate person there, going to corporations and selling a given idea, that a given set of ideas actually, that are, just there to make people feel, a little bit more accepted in their workplaces and so on and so forth. But this is not, like a serious systematized movement that people, are religiously, as he says, following. This is just, these examples of corporations trying to spread this, obviously, in the center of avoiding to speaking about class relations, avoiding, the talk about material conditions and so on and so forth, and just staying at the level of, certain things about race and gender and so on and so forth.
Robin DiAngelo hasn't been well received. Yeah, no, she's largely treated with skepticism at best by most people on the left that I've spoken to. I mean, on the left, whatever that means. But like, it's I don't know, how would I characterize her? Like her whole thing again is trying to jump on a trend and market it, but she's you won't find a reference to Hegel in there, I don't think.
I mean, if she ever says dialectical, that's it. She's a Hegelian, you know.
There's a left-wing streamer called Jangle Science Lad who I think put it perfectly, because they had a debate and they essentially said that white fragility, the concept is worth discussing, but fuck, I hate that book because they do not argue it well at all.
Yeah.
The other thing too about the Pokemon woke, this is woke, that is woke thing, is it kind of works with Dr. Sadler's point about bullshit, right? So if two completely contradictory things could both be woke, then, you know, what are we actually tracking with the concept of woke anymore, right? Like, what is, like, there's actual legitimate arbitrariness there, right? And that's what happens when you get a lot of these things, and that's what marks something, unfortunately. And I know Zan are sort of, the jury is out as to whether or not this is borderline propagandistic or ideological or not. But that's often what marks that type of rhetoric, is that it's not that it doesn't track a truth, it's that it's not capable of being truth tracking, right? Like, it just can't.
Yeah,
So,
that's the feeling I'm getting out of what woke means to him, or that it's not a box, that when things are in it, it takes on the categories and descriptions that box confers to it. Instead, that box exists purely for things to be put in it. And then you can ascribe whatever meaning you want to it, because woke means whatever it means to these people. And I don't think they share their definitions. I think they all just agree that it's uncanny.
Right. And it's not even like it's done in a kind of a meta-aware way, like, you know, with Wittgenstein's cluster concepts, where these things have no necessary traits in common, only maybe accidental properties in common. There's nothing that they all share, and yet they can kind of be taken conceptually, be the same thing. It's not even at that level of thinking necessarily. That's what bugs me. So it's not like, oh, it's just a cluster concept. It's like, no, it really isn't though. Like, that's not even, there's not even a sense of it being a cluster concept anymore. It's truly just arbitrary semantics in some senses.
Slightly above my head, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Well, it's just like, so if you have like 2 or 3 people and they have to have all the same qualities, right? In order to be part of the same category, like a flower has petals, or it has a leaf, or it's a certain color or whatever. And you have 3 sort of, how do I describe it? Particulars that all seem to match these, they all seem to have these properties in common. And then we decide that we're going to get a universal out of that, like, not to, you know, Russell it or whatever, but like Russell talks about this in terms of universals. Sometimes you have concepts where this person's, let's say, and you get this a lot with social categories. So this is a woman, that's a woman, this is a woman. But none of these women actually have any specific traits in common, and yet we kind of take them socially to be part of the category woman. So some people will say things like the use of the word woke is similar to that. It's a cluster concept. There's no necessary properties in common between any instance of woke, but we can kind of get this general sense of woke. And what I'm saying is that's not even what's going on there. Like, they're not even thinking it through at that level. So that's kind of the point I'm trying to make there. Yeah. So
it's pretty obvious. Robin DiAngelo feels as though she has been saved in an anti-racist religion. She knows that racism is bad, that she feels like she's done the proper atonement, that she should have received grace, but because it's a Puritan mindset that she's operating within, she's got scrupulosity probably, which is a form of OCD, if I had to guess. Can't diagnose her for sure. She enters into this humiliation where she tries to repeatedly show that she's utterly depraved and therefore going to be able to be worthy of justification and then eventually glorification. And so this is the mindset of the woke. You can see this as a very religious way when you read Robin DiAngelo, if you're familiar with Puritan tracts. So the big idea, there are lots of big ideas in Hegel, lots of things going on.
I will just point out something. King Crocoduck did just make a good point. That some people abuse the term neo-Marxism doesn't imply that it's meaningless. So there is like a positive way to use the term neo-Marxist, which again is referring to like the Frankfurt School, people like that, which is fine. The problem again is in the context of this particular speaker. He's applying.
I would just call them Marxists.
Well, I think they call themselves neo-Marxists. Did they not?
And just to clarify what Sunday's saying. Yeah, just clarify one part what Sunday's saying. When he's saying there's a positive way of using it, it doesn't mean a good way. He means there's an actual definition associated with it. There's an actual thing associated with it. It's not just a word that's thrown out there. So that's what you mean by positive, right?
I'm just looking it up quickly. I want to make sure that I'm right on this. I don't actually know off the top of my head if they called themselves that. No, they never. The Frankfurt School never identified themselves as neo-Marxists. So that was incorrect.
I could just not be familiar at all with like the neo preposition, how it gets used. Where I think of like a neo something as like a reconstitution or a rebirth of that idea after its disillusionment. That's how I think of that idea. But Marxism never went away. The Frankfurt School, as I understand it, was just Marxism in a new perspective, in a new direction. That's why I don't like, it's like we're not in neo-philosophy because Einstein undid Newton. It's still a continuation of that philosophical trend of trying to identify epistemic truths.
Such a good point.
Yeah, we know, well put. That actually clarifies things a lot. Let's get going.
I want to follow that particular track, Hegel to the young Hegelian movement, to Marx, to neo-Marxism and postmodernism in a broken way, to the woke. And so the one that I want to focus on centrally is this operating system that Hegel laid out in an applicative way probably for the first time, which is the dialectic. The dialectic is thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Those are the words you usually hear. So you have some idea, that's a thesis. You're met with its opposite, that's the antithesis. And you have to contemplate the two, figure out a way to bring them together into something that unifies the ideas, and that's a synthesis that's supposed to provide more information. A higher understanding is a better way to phrase that, I'm sorry, of the circumstance. So the thesis is an idea that has been forwarded. It misses something. Its antithesis reveals the contradictions from what it's missing, and its synthesis arrives out of it. So this can be traced back to Socratic
can I say
thought.
something
There was
here?
a positive.
So, I mean, there's a little bit of truth here because at some points in Hegel's writings, he seems to be presenting, this notion of the three moments of what he calls the three moments of any concept, right? And I don't think he ever says, the thesis and antithesis and all of that. But, he nevertheless talks about three moments. Again, he has sort of this analysis where there is a contemplation after a given concept has been negated of the entire process. And that is what makes the negation of the original, understanding of any given concept not, like when you negate it, you're not left with nothing. Okay, it might seem like you're left with nothing, but in reality, there's something there. And this is, I think that the key point about what we can call Hegelian dialectics. But, like this simplistic notion of antithesis is, life is always more complicated, as I always say. And obviously Hegel was not, that simplistic, but he nevertheless did have sort of a conceptualization, of the progression of concepts. And this is also part of what the materialist criticism of idealism is at the same time. Is and how does this process occur? Does it occur by just minds talking to each other? Does it occur by concepts speaking to each other, or is it like an actual warfare in the material world that in a sense gives rise to this movement of ideas and so on and so forth? And then there's also the feedback of the ideas into the material. But like this is more or less what I think he's trying to express here, but obviously in a very simplistic fashion. But it is true that Hegel had some notion of philosophical progression via some kind of a contradiction between two opposed sides that leaves something open, not just nothingness.
Well, ZahnZee, this actually brings to mind, again, your Final Fantasy and ideology video. You give sort of the history of these different understandings of what ideology is. When he says like terms like operating system, and the way he treats the dialectic as sort of just this algorithm that we filter all of our information through, all of our inputs through, that is to reduce all of Hegel effectively to what would be understood as an ideology under the liberal definition, as you described it. I mean, that this seems to be
action-oriented belief.
It's more specifically in the liberal context, it's a thing that a liberal individual has. It's a lens has appended to them to allow them to do a thing. And he's not giving a gloss on Hegel. He's using Hegel as a distant and therefore very difficult to challenge way for most people to psychologize people on the left generally. It's like, there's a computer virus in their system, and this is where it comes from. I don't know. I just thought that was interesting.
To invoke religious language, is it like he's arguing that these are the 3 commandments of wokeism?
I think it's more like he's arguing that this is like an evil spirit that's possessing people. Like I don't think that there are commandments as such. I think the lack of rigidity, then rigidified in this sort of caricature, is sort of how he goes about slandering people on the left. It's saying that, hey, look, they just have this sort of mad, violent, self-eating process that's just possessing them.
When you said he thought it was a spirit, my mind immediately went to, I wonder if the Warrens have dealt with it.
And negative versions of this. Of note, I suppose we should say that Hegel never actually framed the dialectic this way, as thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That's Kant's organization. Hegel borrowed from Kant. His own formulation was actually abstract, negative, concrete. So you have an abstract idea, abstract understanding of something, it meets its negative, and that allows you to derive something concrete from it, which is clearly reflected in the neo-Marxist literature repeatedly, if you've read it, because the neo-Marxist literature constantly calls for engaging in so-called negative thinking. And negative thinking is bringing that negative to bear, which is the critique, Marx's ruthless critique or criticism of everything that exists. That's bringing the negative to bear on the abstract so that you can synthesize it to the concrete, which is a concrete solution, which usually for them means something looking like communism.
I mean, there is so far I haven't heard anything that, you know, like made me think, okay, this is completely out of focus, because there is truth in this concept, and this is also Marx's method of exposition in Das Kapital, which is going from more abstract propositions into more concrete ones. And I think that this is also how science needs to progress. Okay, we start with, okay, so I like this example that I heard once, which is, you know, who is being more concrete when they go to the park? For example, a child that looks at trees and just sees trees and says, okay, this is a tree, this is a tree. Or, you know, a specialist in tree biology, well, you know, in the thing about trees, that says, no, this is a species of tree of this and that, and this other tree is a species of that, you know? Like, who is being more concrete? Obviously, the scientist is being more concrete there. But you need to start from certain level of abstraction of saying, okay, all of these belong to the category of trees. And then within this category, we can get more specific. And this is what I think science, in a sense, does. And this is also part of what Marx's own method of exposition is in Das Kapital, at least, you know? So, and there is truth to that, but I don't see any religious component to this. This is just a methodology for philosophical and scientific progression, you know?
So I can kind of see how this works in terms of Marxist or Marxian thinking, but I do have a bit of an issue with how, again, he's characterizing Hegel. One of the, I don't think it's a rhetorical ploy necessarily, because I don't think he's aware of it, but one of the difficulties with a lot of this exposition is he frames things in terms of discrete, concrete, metaphysical entities that can be derived from specific processes. And so again, when we're looking at things like the self sees itself in the negation in another human being, and that kind of like the way in which consciousness works, or these other kind of perceptual processes work, what's happening is the person is emerging, the individual is emerging in that process. The being themselves are emerging in that process. And so as a result of that, you're getting a type of being that emerges, not this kind of concrete rock of a product that can then be used, and that can then be used for some other type of rhetoric. So certainly that might characterize like the movement from abstraction to concreteness in Marxist thinking, but it doesn't really characterize at least what's going on in the phenomenology. And furthermore, I think your point's extremely important about how concreteness tracks, I don't know how to describe it, empirical acuity, scientific progress, etc. Except I think a better word for it would be descriptive detail rather than concreteness, because concreteness kind of has this association with reification. You can't fix it, you can't adjust it, you can't swap out properties, you can't question or doubt aspects of it. It has a sort of overdetermined kind of framework to it. So I think that what we're looking for ideally in a practice of good science is descriptive detail as opposed to the establishment of concreteness. So again, like I think he overemphasizes the idea of concreteness or these kind of like discrete metaphysical products that can come out of these kinds of processes, right?
Well, I mean, I'm forgetting the exact wording here. If he was indicating that sort of this Hegelian mode of thinking inevitably leads to communism, again, he is ignoring here Marx's entire critique of Hegel in that he naturalizes the state, sort of like how Aristotle naturalizes the polis as being the final end product of absolute spirit. This is where human beings actualize themselves fully, is in a state with all of the inequalities and the hierarchies and all that stuff that comes with it intrinsically. So I mean, that just doesn't follow. And there are Hegelians that still exist who still advocate that position.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. You know, like Hegel never gave a definition of a fading away of the state. The complete opposite. He gave, a definition
a crystallizing
of how
of the state in its true form.
Exactly. So, like, dialectics doesn't get you to necessarily to communism. You know, so I mean, like, you know, at the level of which we are operating with the ideas of James Lindsay here, you know, I think we're giving him too much credit by talking about all of these specificities. You know,
I think we're just putting off having to listen to more of them.
It's kind of what I was getting at earlier, where that it's almost like you're trying to just paint this very neat linear line when either he's deliberately ignoring them, or he's so ignorant of the subject matter that he doesn't realize how many splintering contradictions he's creating with his arguments. Because exactly like Victor said, it's not the dialectic that leads towards a dissolution of the state. That's a very particular reading of a dialectic that Marx and Engels applied towards trying to understand the development of human society, where they just tried to project into the future in the way that empirical scientists do, of just using the abstract theory that I have in front of me. I'm going to try hypothesize where this is going, and they thought it's going to end in the dissolution of the state. But that's not really dialectics that did that. That's them applying the process of a dialectic and trying to figure out where it's going. And part of where I'm kind of coming at with this idea is because 2 years ago I was doing an undergraduate in astrophysics, and math got to me, so I had to drop out. But the one thing that I got immediately, and how it applies to a lot of what I'm thinking, is that whenever we did our labs, we went in there with abstract theory, nothing concrete in the slightest. We went in there with like ideal formulas. Like the best way I can think is like Boyle's ideal gas law. And what we did is we devised experiments with the intention of drawing contradictions, so that we could examine the contradiction to see how much of the truth we were able to access. And part of what this came down to, and I remember my lab instructor saying this, the most important part of your results is your error. If you can't accurately calculate error, then you don't actually know how much of reality you've discovered. And the whole point is the contradiction is important in identifying concrete reality, because all you have access to is the abstract, because that's kind of where we begin our investigation. And that does not mean that that's where reality begins. That's where we begin. That's how we begin assessing the process. And within kind of like that scientific approach, I don't know how that applies to Lindsay, but I get the feeling he's just completely ignorant to that process.
Yeah, like Lindsay wouldn't care about falsification as legitimate scientific practice, like at all, I'd say. But that's an extremely like important distinction to make, which is that, you know, as you were saying, the theory is held up by by disproving the opposite cases, right? Because part of the problem we have is that when we establish a view on something, we don't know what we don't know. And we have to try to establish, to as much of an extent as possible, what we don't know, right? Like it's in order to like be certain about what we do know. That's really, really important.
I like even just to mention something like contemporary, particle physics is really excited right now, because with the new CERN collider, they're after finding maybe the beginnings potentially of a result that contradicts the standard model. And basically what that leads towards is, the thing about physics that I loved is that when you get an answer that agrees with the theory, that's not really exciting. When you find something that contradicts the theory, that's exciting. And that's where how I play with dialectics, that's where it's important to me, because the contradiction is vital to the progression of whatever the hell life is.
Yeah, absolutely.
For example, just to pull one example out of Herbert Marcuse, I've read Herbert Marcuse's Repressive Tolerance essay before. I've read selections from his One-Dimensional Man. We're going to cover some of both of those again in this episode. But in his 1969 essay on liberation, which I intend to read for the podcast in full with commentary fairly soon, I have not read that one yet, but we encounter this paragraph.
You know what's conspicuous about this, actually? I'm just going to jump on this for a second before we move on. He is assiduously avoiding quoting anything from Hegel.
He probably hasn't even read.
There's no way in hell he's read Hegel. Hegel is bloody difficult, as we were talking about earlier. If he had read Hegel, like even just the preface, well, maybe not just the preface, but if he had read Hegel, he wouldn't be able to say any of this without like overtly lying. Which again is why I think this is half ghost written. There's just no way in hell that this person's actually read any serious material on this guy, because
I'm honestly wondering how much of this is informed from the Wikipedia entry for the Hegelian dialectic, because I feel like he's raising his points at about the same points the Wikipedia raises them.
Yeah, that's possible. Or I mean, to go back to Hicks again, but then to be totally honest with you, who's to say Hicks isn't doing that either? His book came out when, like 2010.
Yeah, I was going to say.
So, yeah.
Marcuse writes, but the demand to state the concrete alternatives to, say, the failing states of the world, capitalist states particularly that he's looking at, but also the failures of attempted socialist and communist states. He says, but the demand to state the concrete alternatives is justified for yet another reason. Negative thinking, there it is, draws whatever force it may have from its empirical basis, the actual human condition.
I like how he wants. There it is. There it is. There it is. The woke, right there.
Experiences where suffering and oppression are. Let's tap into those. And we're going to use negative thinking to do so. And it's empirical because we're looking at the actual experiences people are having, the actual human condition. And then you're going to compare that, he writes, and the given possibilities to transcend this condition, to enlarge the realm of freedom. In this sense, negative thinking is by virtue of its own internal concepts positive. Negative thinking is positive.
Love is hate. Peace is war.
Oh God, it's just flat out misunderstanding what those terms actually refer to, right?
Yeah, I'm wondering, is like my understanding of negation in terms of how it fits into the dialectic isn't just critique. It isn't just negative. It's it's a fundamental contradiction of how you assumed it would be. But because it's real, it means that you've made a contradiction in your understanding of the thing. So you have to subsume it. Otherwise, you are out of sync with reality and your understanding of it.
Sure. I mean, I think in many ways it can be easily defined as the opposite. Yeah, it can be easily defined as the opposite of something. Like not that if we want to be reductive about it, a better word would be opposite, right? And so basically it's when you're encountering the thing that isn't you, or something is encountering another thing that has its own consciousness that's encountering it, or you're in a relation where you know that this is this because it's not that. It's a way of describing and defining categorical thinking and thinking about being. It's not about negative is positive or whatever. Like I don't know what he's doing there. Like it's honestly so frustrating.
Like it's I'm reaching completely outside of myself here, where I don't know if this is true or not, but like could this be thought of in the terms like the delineation between subject and object requires that negation, because definitionally an object can't be you and your perspective, so you're required to engage in that idea.
I'm just going to disappear for 5 minutes, guys. You keep going.
Yeah, we're quite.
I mean, like I was just struck by how he was reading the quote, and at some point he read the sentence, what was it? Negative thinking or something like that. And then he said, "There you go." He stopped for a second to say, "There you go. That is it. That is the conspiracy that he has built in his head, confirmed in the very text that I'm reading to you." So he likes to look for specific keywords and then say, okay, so everything in my mind is justified by this specific word that I read in this specific paragraph from this specific work that may not necessarily even be like a full description of anything, and this is really what I think he's doing here. He's in a sense building a narrative, okay, that is a purely ideological narrative and trying to justify it with whatever, okay, whatever he can find, he's going to try to justify his narrative with it. And he presents this general picture about the woke and about the linear progression from Hegel to the modern wokeness and all of that. And this is just a mental exercise in a sense to put forth an ideological narrative, and it obviously has a lot of implications for not only discourse, but also a lot of implications for the real world, because these narratives are today in the United States and in Europe, really strong in the far right, and they are becoming, more and more popular in like high levels of political decision making. And this is important because then these narratives affect the real world. Okay, they are ideological, they are pure mental constructs, but they can affect the world in a very negative fashion. And this is why I think that the exercise that we're doing here of trying to tear it apart and to criticize it is important, because obviously we also need to engage in like serious institutional condemnation of this kind of thinking, but it's also important to, in a sense, present the intellectual reasons for why this kind of rhetoric is completely false and completely misleading and actually dangerous.
But I wonder what we can do to resource people better to understand that what's going on here is blatant actual cherry picking, right? Like how do we make people aware of what counts as cherry picking, short of them having read the primary sources or people being informed as the actual positions? It's almost like it's a critical thinking education exercise or something, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. I mean, I only watched before the stream, I only watched 5 minutes. And my head was going around in so many places that I couldn't watch any more than that. I just watched the first 5 minutes, and I couldn't watch anymore because, this was really hard.
And to the point you're mentioning, Victor, in terms of that, it's cherry picking positions to strengthen a narrative position. It's something I'm actively researching at the moment, so I'm not comfortable to put it forward as the way it is, but it's something I'm investigating. It's that I think the link between what we're seeing here and something like the foundation of an ideological consistency within fascism. Now, I feel like I contradicted myself in saying that, but it's the way I'm thinking about it at the moment, is that part of what Lindsay is doing right now is the construction of a mythology in terms of a substantiating narrative of this is the reason we should come together, where it's more than just a story. It's a founding creed to explain why we should form this imaginary community, and they don't belong in it. It's part of where I'm thinking. Go on.
The great irony here is that he's criticizing, his mental construct of the woke for being religious. But what he's doing in that sense has a lot of sectarian, in a sense, elements to it. Okay, of manufacturing a narrative that is based on certain bits of truth, but that in general is complete. Mental constructs that in the end justify a given set of interests of a very specific group of people, and that can be used in order to to seriously damage the human rights and all of the improvements that we've made in the past decades. So this is really important to see how he's projecting, in a sense, whether consciously or not, his own failures into those of whatever he's trying to criticize, because we're yet to see what he's criticizing. But here I read somebody in the comments here said that neo-Marxism really exists. They say that it's real. The fact that right-wingers, this is what they say, don't understand what neo-Marxism is doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. I agree completely with this point. Okay, so neo-Marxism actually exists, and there's different definitions. What I was trying to get when I said at the beginning that neo-Marxism is really a mental construct is that what the right wing has made it out to be is basically, cultural Marxism, which is, this Nazi conspiracy theory about there being some kind of Jewish, elite of thinkers that are trying to, in a sense, instill their own, propaganda for their own sake into the minds of the very bright and the very young, white, middle class people. And this is basically what neo-Marxism has become in the modern right-wing American discourse, and that is also being shipped to Europe. And I'm saying that in Spain here we have a lot of that. and it is actually taken from the United States. I see so
Yeah.
many times, and I'm pretty sure that even in Ireland and in Great Britain, that's for sure, and in many other places in Europe, this is completely the case, that they are literally with their own, with our own, national, in a sense, prejudices. They are taking those of the American right, because America in a sense is guiding a lot of things in this sense, because it is the cultural center of almost all of the West right now, America, and in a sense they're just like incorporating those into their nationalist projects here, and in here in Spain, I mean, and in Ireland and in all of these places. But this is really what it is. It's just an ideological narrative that is trying to promote very, very, very damaging agendas.
And I think it's important to note too that obviously mental representations coming from more of a I don't know, phenomenology perspective rather than like a Marxist thought perspective, although I'm obviously extremely sympathetic to that. Mental representations are inevitable, right? And so obviously we're going to have, and of course we all know this, and we know that there's going to be bias, and there's going to be a sense of like what's called normative judgments on things that we encounter in the world. So we see things as aesthetically beautiful or ugly, good or bad, and then we want to sort of start inquiring and thinking about them on those grounds. But what's going on here, and I wonder either Victor or Zane, what you might think about this, the problem isn't so much the types, people getting embedded or enmeshed in their own mental representations, but those mental representations being very much things that can be consumed and dispersed and moved around from market to market and used to bolster specific, regional or collective agendas in this kind of ideological sense. Because as you were both talking about it, I noticed that we talk about these things if they can be exported like they're consumer goods. And they probably can be, and they're sort of framed and marketed as such, so that what's less relevant is how we're representing the world and what vision of reality on, let's say, a metaphysical level we're putting forward. And what's more relevant is like, what makes the most sense for me to consume and is the most useful for me in that process of consumption. Like, I can't help but see this as a kind of consumptive process as well.
All right.
Yeah, I can get that.
Sorry for my absence. I've got a delicate constitution, and the amount of bullshit that we're consuming here is a bit hard.
Oh, no worries.
So,
I just want to say one thing very quickly. In terms to very quickly just kind of like answer the question raised at the very beginning in Victor's chat in terms of, is neo-Marxism real? Me personally, I will always advocate that I don't think it's a real thing, but I can bridge it with a sociological template that I've kind of constructed recently. That I took this out of a where is it? It's a sociological book that I'm reading at the moment, just on like a sociological analysis of ethnicity and nationalism. And it's basically a way of thinking about social or cultural contexts. So I'll apply this here and just see if this is agreeable, because if it is, then I can agree to this and we're in agreement. That it's the concept of neo-Marxism can be important to the extent that that concept can inform people's actions. And at this level, neo-Marxism will exist as a cultural concept. A cultural construct. Whether it actually has a basis in reality or not, that is irrelevant. A social scientist can study this concept, not because they themselves have to believe in its existence, but since the object of their study is the social or cultural relevance that the notion that concept exists. Therefore, they're studying the impact of that idea and not how, quote unquote, real the idea is.
Yeah.
If they agree with that, then we're totally in agreement.
That seems right.
Yeah, I mean, like my opinion here is that there is certain elements, okay, that we can point to that, in a sense, support, some kind of a movement that we can call neo-Marxism, but that in general, okay, the only important thing is what you said, right? Is the study of the set of social forces that are mobilized according to this given idea. And this is what I'm saying, that what neo-Marxism has really become is just, this boogeyman of the right that is also, it's synonymous with cultural Marxism today for the American right, once again, which is basically a conspiracy theory of the Nazis. Okay, so that is pretty much.
I think it maintains its usefulness insofar as we want to make a periodical distinction between, contemporaries of Marx and those immediately following after him, and then people in the 20th century. And I think that's fair.
So is there neo-socialism? Otherwise, we're not being consistent.
Well, I don't. Again, like it's a term applied from outside. I don't think it has much content except as a period. What's the word I'm looking for? It designates the period in which we're referring, or something like that.
It honestly just feels wholly arbitrary. Like it's not actually carrying with it a descriptive context with it, where everyone you could describe as a neo-Marxist, you could also describe as a Marxist, and I don't think you lose anything by omitting the neo part. So it's kind of like if it doesn't provide descriptive utility, then I can't think of the term, but it's superfluous. Go on.
Yeah, if anything, there's more demandingness around saying that what was kind of being glibly referred to as neo-Marxist is Marxist, because then you're integrating into and living up to a tradition of thought and action that has moral consequence. Like it's almost more demanding and importantly demanding. Say, no, this is actually Marxist thinking. Let's think about this. Let's think about how effective this is. Let's think about its use for us. Let's think about its use for contemporary movements. And so I think there's some importance in retaining and enriching existing categories and not giving in to, how do I put it, external classifications of movements that people exist internally within and know more about than the outside could, right?
Yeah, so I think that the utility that this concept really provides is for the right to promote their magical idea of Marxism failed, and now it's trying to be reincorporated into the leftist propaganda via a set of new ideas, and this is neo-Marxism. Once Marxism failed with the Soviet Union and all of that, now, and this is pretty much Jordan Peterson 101, okay, this is the utility of neo-Marxism. The utility is for right-wingers to claim that once Marxism was defeated in that great time of the Cold War, then a set of evil people tried to reincorporate it so that we could have another socialist movement, and they obviously couldn't just do the old stuff, so they needed to include more stuff, and this is what the neo is for.
I think they're just trying to scare people. I think that's all it is.
No, honestly, you're over there apparently. I'm coming around to ZahnZee's way of thinking about this, because I was pushing like, okay, maybe there's like some efficiency gained. Like if you're not really doing a fine-grained analysis of a particular thinker, what have you, you can say, well, the neo-Marxists, what common thread between them? But there aren't a whole lot of those actually, when you look really carefully. And I feel like if you're going to invoke particular thinkers like that, just say who you're talking about. Like cite the actual thing you're referring to. Otherwise, what's the point?
I think
maybe this is just philosophy of language, but its prefixes have to mean something.
Exactly.
Like the difference between a meter and a nanometer is incredibly important. And if they can mean the same thing, then what was the point of the prefix?
Well, and also we have to think about pragmatics too. And so when you're denoting something or you're engaging in semantics, which is literally just using literal language, using a set of structures to describe something, you have to think about what it's evoking, and so what's implied, like the implicature behind that statement. And so often, if we don't know what something's denoting or literally saying, like what these prefixes are useful for, we have to think about what's being implied in the background. And if that implication does something to weaken the original word or to put some other kind of ideological baggage on it, or serves a purpose other than description, which of course a lot of concepts and words do, like, murder serves a purpose that killing doesn't, because there's a normative aspect to this, right?
And it's without semantics, connotation disappears.
Well, yes, but the worst part is that when people use semantics, like literal words, prefixes and suffixes, to hide the
Oh, you're cutting out there, Djalma. Coming closer.
To hide the pragmatics, to hide the connotation, to hide the hidden ideology behind those direct literal statements, then you have to go digging. You have to say, okay, what is implied here? What is the speaker likely to infer from this? And go into all these other kind of behaviors. And so there's something about it where when the word doesn't actually denote what it says it does, and there's something hiding in the background, and furthermore, the prefix or suffix doesn't add anything on to the old concept that's significant, then you have to start worrying a little bit, right?
I think the perfect example of what you're talking about would be that famous BBC interview with Jordan Peterson, where he was saying a lot of things abstractly without ever actually, what I call like finishing the sentence, which means that you either have to let it go or you have to then not beg the question. You have to then point at the question. So you end up with the meme of "so you're saying," and I think that's what you're getting at, where that you're forcing them to then have to raise that question, and then they get to reflexively afterwards decide how bad does that sound when you say it out loud. Because if it sounds good, then yeah, I agree with that. If it sounds bad, then you're trying to link me with Nazis.
Exactly. And the way people protect themselves is by using semantic dog whistles and fig leaves and stuff like that, where they're kind of like, they know what they're referring to. They know what the pragmatics are. They know what the connotation is. But if you ever call them on it, plausible deniability, right? They'll never cop to that ever. And so those are the things you have to be careful about.
All right, gentlemen, we've been going for 2 hours. I have a proposal. I have less stamina than all of you, so I'm going to say let's do one more 5-minute block, one more, and then we will chat about it for 5 minutes, and then we will close. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, sounds fair. I'm just going to run to the bathroom in 2 seconds.
Yeah,
no worries.
Me too. At the same time. All right.
All right. Okay, now that the normies are gone.
We are left alone in here.
Oh, we'll wait. There's 2 of them at once. Let's see.
Yeah, well, I mean, at least we got some productive conversations out of this one, and we got Gregory to be here with us as well, which was very fun. So, we got something out of this.
And because he had fun, he might come back. That's what I'm hoping.
Yeah, that's
for.
good.
No, I think this was actually a really good slate. I'm actually really pleased with how this turned out. And honestly, what we got? Hey, we got 13 minutes into Lindsay's 3 hour and 49 minutes. Yeah, so I mean, we can basically milk this for the rest of the year at this rate.
Yeah, I mean, like I don't even know if it gets any worse or not, because as I was saying before, like I only could watch. My mind could only bear 5 minutes of it. Like I only watched the first 5 minutes, and then I was like, I cannot see this anymore. So like I think that we will probably have a lot to talk about, but I don't know exactly how bad it can get within these 4 hours. But man, it's 4 hours of content that he did on this.
Well, I've seen people in the chat who have gone through it saying that he repeats himself quite a bit, which we've seen already.
Yeah, that's for sure.
I mean, again, like he set the terms of the discussion. And
we should do we should count the amount of times that he says woke in this video.
No, I refuse. But I mean, like, he set the terms of the discussion, and in such an incoherent and fraught way, and relying on wordplay. Like, where is he getting the idea that there's this relationship between assuming, and Zahn pointed this out beautifully, that this is itself like a fraught way of sort of conceptualizing things. But even assuming that, okay, we can say that there's this religion of wokeism or this religion of the Hegelian dialectic, the Hermetic. He never even brings in why it's Hermetic, but like that. And then
he never even explains why it is religious. He never gives a definition of what religion
that's
is
to be intuited by the audience.
Is.
Yeah, because it's woo-woo. That's why it's spirit science.
He gives some kind of a hint. And I like this because this is what the right-wing ideologues do all the time. It's like they gesture at something and then they expect the audience to immediately get what they're talking about. So he said at some point, he was talking about Twitter, and whenever he spoke about Hegel, a lot of people came to him and started to respond to him. And then he said, this behavior, this is the kind of behavior that religious people exhibit. And this is all of the evidence that he has provided for dialectical, for Hegelianism in general being a religion, and then everything that comes after it being a religion as well. This is his evidence, is that he got cancelled in Twitter for saying certain things. So this is really his evidence, right?
Did I miss?
No, we waited for you. You and Djalma both left, so we waited. Djalma, are you back yet?
I'm here. Yep.
Brilliant. All right. Yeah. Okay. Last 5 minute stretch.
To piggyback off of what Victor said, like I've been paying close attention to it in like the 12 minutes. He's never once defined religion or examined why it's a religion. He's just called it a religion. Which is it's what like here's the funny thing I had in my mind. Replace the word religion with ice cream, and functionally his sentences are unchanged.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I know what the next thumbnail is going to be.
And just the reason this is important to me is because religion is a thing humans do. You have to study it anthropologically in its most purest form, in my opinion. You can't study it abstractly. You have to study the actual practices that people do, because they're manifesting the abstract into reality through how they socially conduct this worship or religion or whatever way you do it. Now, caveat, everything I'm describing is my own perspective, having grown up in like a Western Europe monotheism. If I was to have grown up anywhere else, I would have a totally different perspective of religion, because here's where it gets really difficult. Religion seems to be one of those things where every single human society in known history has had some sort of religious expression, but not all of them would even call it religious. They would have different words for it, like I'm trailing off. Sorry, go on.
Well, actually,
I'm
just
saying that works with Hegel just really quickly. That works with Hegel much more effectively than anything he's produced, especially given what Greg was talking about earlier with Hegel viewing, human beings as the proper object of religion and us as being, constitutionally religiously inflected and all that kind of thing. So, that's much more to the point than anything he's talking about.
Well, Zan, you remember when you and I were going to debate Mouth the Infidel and Dario, and they chickened out.
I'm so glad that didn't happen.
Oh God, that would have been a nightmare. But what I was going to, go on.
I didn't know they chickened out. I just kind of
I'm
myself to my
they
face
blocked
of just
us both, and they didn't go through with it. So I mean, how
it didn't happen, and my sanity thanks them for it. It's just because I don't want to badmouth them live on air. It's just my feelings are probably obvious at this point.
Well, what I was going to say is, like, in preparation, well, not in preparation for that, what I was going to bring up in that one, like when you're characterizing religion as having these specific qualities, you have to be super careful what you mean, because the actual term itself, there's a reason why it occurs in so much theory going back so far, and that's because, by and large, this is all stuff coming out of Latin philosophy. When you look at, like, the earliest use of the term religion referred to a feeling that individual people had. It had no structural connotations, except insofar as certain, like, institutional structures evoke that feeling. So, like, you swear an oath, there's a religio about it. It had a meaning sort of equivalent to, like, scruples or care or seriousness. It's only with Cicero onwards that you have this distinction between superstitio and religio, where you start to have, like, these categories that have a content besides just a feeling associated with them. And it's only after the Christianization of Rome that you start to distinguish between the different religios of different monks. And then onward from that, you have anthropologists trying to find the different religions, it being denuded of its original, like, sort of, what we would call its religiously specific content, to be sort of a global category. And you have, like, the world religions, and it confuses anthropologists all the time, because it's like, well, why are the Muslims and the Hindus going to the same temples? Well, it's because they aren't churches. And that this is, of course, the flaw that I find with Durkheim. His theory works very well when you're applying it specifically to sort of modern Christian forms and to non-Christian societies, insofar as they are nonetheless adhering to Christian form, the relationship between church and state and things like that. But as soon as you try to use it as, like, this is a thing that has specific psychological characteristics, unless you're actually going way back to that original usage, it's a vacuous statement. You're not talking about anything. A case in point, like, he's using the word religion as if it's disparaging. The entire history of Western philosophy up until the Enlightenment is 90% religious thinkers doing it. The very methods of critique that he is very badly bringing to bear on Hegel here are themselves, again, the results of the work done by religious thinkers. Whatever you think of their religious beliefs, at the end of the day, to equivocate religion with sort of unthinking woo-woo is just ridiculous.
Yeah. Very quickly, I just want to address something that Peter Parker in my chat said. But very first, just welcome in Chud Logic's Raiders. We've probably got another like 15-20 minutes in us, but enjoy your stay while you're here for a second. But Peter Parker asked that it's like maybe Lindsay means it more in kind of like it's a cultish aspect of religion. The first thing I have to say from a study of religion's perspective, that cults are a very specific thing, and they don't just mean group of secretive people hanging out in basements, sacrificing virgins. That's not what cult means. all of the original Greek deities had cults surrounding them, because cults tend to be kind of like groups of religious affirmation towards a particular deity, and this is to denote it from kind of like religion, sect, cults. These are all very different ideas, and the connotation that cults took in modern context actually makes it very difficult to study cults, because nobody wants to let you study them because you're going to call them what they are, and the word has a horrible connotation. So I'd be very careful about how we approach these conversations, just in that regard. But I do think that's what Lindsay is getting at, but he doesn't want to be accused of slurring Hegel.
Oh, I don't think he's worried about being accused of slurring Hegel. I'll push back a little on that. All right, 5 more minutes. 5, and then we're done. Nobody say anything for 5 minutes, and then you have 5 minutes to talk, and then we're calling it. Okay. Yeah. If anybody needs to go earlier, feel free. Don't feel like you have to stick around for this. We'll do this again sometime, though, for sure.
Oh, 100%.
Isn't that
30 more videos? Yeah.
Exactly. No, at this rate, God no. It's going to be like
what do you?
This is it from now on. This is the channel.
That means is oriented toward comprehending a future which is contained in the present. This containment idea is going to be very important also, that this perfect future that negative thinking can unleash is contained in the present. The philosophy here, the metaphysic here, is actually that if we could just get the problems off of that contained future, then the contained future could emerge, right? So what we have here is somebody believing that there's this kind of perfect future, and if we could just get the problems off of it by using negative thinking, we could peel away all the problematics. We could expose all the contradictions. We could expose all of the systems of oppression that prevent it from being perfect. Then that seed that's contained within in the present day would be able to blossom into a fully liberated society. That's the essay on liberation, right? That's a very important way. We're going to come back to this again and again. It's a very important way to understand the way that these people think. And it's crucial to understand that this approach. But to go back to Marcuse, he writes, and this containment, which is an important aspect of the general containment policy pursued by the established societies. And in this containment, the future appears as possible liberation. So that's what I was just saying. In the contained within the society, we see the seed of liberation.
Come on, Lindsay, you can do it.
Society that cannot and does not exist anywhere on Earth up to this point. And he writes, it is not the only alternative. The advent of a long period of civilized barbarism, with or without the nuclear destruction, is equally contained in the present. So there could be good roads or bad roads. Negative thinking and the praxis guided by it is the positive and positing effort to prevent this utter negativity. So he frames out negative thinking as positive, and he says that it allows us to peel away the constraints of a civilized barbarism in the established societies, peel away the problematics, and get the seed of a more perfected future using negative thinking and the praxis guided by it. Praxis is what you have when you combine theory, meaning really Hegelian reason, as we're going to see, but we could say critical theory, we could say postmodern theory, we could say woke or theory, if you want, what we just call capital T theory, put into practice. That's what praxis is.
Can we pause for a second?
Yes.
Has he just fundamentally misunderstood the role of reaction in terms of how we identify right in society? Where it's not that we peel back the bad to get at the good that was always going to be there. It's that through examining the contradictions of the quote-unquote bad, we gain a more authentic understanding of what the good is at all. So it seems like he's totally misunderstood Hegel in this regard. Now, there's one funny thing that I do want to notice, and that he seems to be kind of like really annoyed in this perspective that what leftists are doing is they're just like unpeeling the negatives to achieve the perfect society, when let me ever so slightly change this to reveal the conservative perspective, which is if we can just unpeel the negatives to return to our perfect society.
Well put.
Well,
I mean, I would have just said you can shorten that to the first 5 words, and the answer would be yes. Yeah, we're gonna call it here. No more 5 minutes.
Yeah. So here's a thought that I had in relation to that, which was basically that when you look at certain forms of, quotes, leftist inquiry, and we've had a lot of discussions about how increasing descriptive detail, right, and increasing deliberateness and revealing our assumptions and revealing the values that go into our statements being the most important aspect of that kind of critical inquiry, so-called. When you engage in that process, it never fucking ends, right? Like that's just the entire, that's your whole life. And then you'll die and then somebody else will take it up, and you get Kuhnian research paradigms, for instance, like in philosophy of science, where people will just go on for centuries like this. And so the idea that we would be like unearthing the seed, like it's some kind of anime plot, you know, of the good from the negative becomes the positive, and some kind of like, you know, Castlevania woo, sorry to say, I'm watching it recently. I love it, but it's pretty bad that way, is kind of absurd, because the whole purpose of the process of inquiry and increasing descriptive detail and understanding and bringing more people bringing more people into enlightening more people into an enlightened or liberated state of being or consciousness involves a process that doesn't end and increases in care and complexity and detail over time, and involves just consistently reevaluating assumptions and acting in accordance with what we think the good is at that juncture. There's no telos that's being revealed. There's no seed of good that emerges from negation. It's literally, just quite literally, an endless descriptive epistemic process that we just go through for as long as we need to, and that could be indefinite. And that doesn't mean that it's pointless.
Until we
It means
die,
that we're actually
basically.
constantly adjusting. Yeah, like it's the opposite.
If
right?
I want to use the most crass analogy I possibly can, it's that when you have a lot of layers on a body, you have an inauthentic understanding of the silhouette of that body. And then what you do is you identify those layers and you peel them away. And the more layers, you just end up with a more authentic silhouette to that body. It's not that these are bad. It's just you discover that the layer is not what the body is. And you don't necessarily discard it. You just take it into your understanding of what the body is. And like a coat is not part of your torso. And you can only understand this by recognizing the contradiction that a coat is not the body. That's the most simplest analogy also, I can give here.
Yeah, and also, can you imagine stopping that process at any juncture and saying, yeah, I've come to the capital T truth about what the body is. I'm done. It's like, no, like nobody ever does that. That goes against the spirit of inquiry itself. Like,
well, hold on, you just described modesty in conservative culture.
Oh, God. Yeah, well, fair enough. There's a lot of projection here going on, right? On their end.
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder if he's ever going to present any sort of a refutation or criticism of this idea that we just described, of what he's calling there the negative thinking, right? The negative process of proceeding, of going about, improving any concept or any state of affairs. I wonder if he's ever going to critique it, because it seems to be so, I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure after 50 hours of this, we'll find out.
Because I'm not sure he'll ever unpack the term. I think he just thinks like negative is so obvious that he can continue to talk about it.
I think he's just going to present it there and expect his audience to immediately think, okay, this is terrible, without even thinking about what it is or how it actually operates. He's just presenting it and then expecting people to immediately have some kind of disgust for it, some kind of feeling of aversion. It's like a conservative saying, like something that to anyone with an actual sense of morality might seem like totally ordinary, like and look at this gay person kissing his partner in the street, and then he immediately expects everyone to feel disgusted at it. But like, if you don't have that irrational disgust, if you don't have that irrational feeling of aversion, you're just left with a statement of like, why even point that out? And this is the same thing. He's just pointed out one particular concept and expecting people to immediately feel some kind of aversion to it. But he's not actually going to present, and this is what I think is going to happen. He's never going to present an actual refutation of what this is or anything, really.
No, it's bigotry. It's just flat out bigotry against the thinkers in this orbit. And I mean, he's bringing to bear all of the analytical rigor of The Secret. So
Like what's funny
and
is
the whole like seed of goodness is, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Djalma, please, for the love of God, come closer to your microphone. Sorry, Zan.
I'm right in front of it though. Like I don't know what to do.
Oh,
is it really that bad?
It might be connection. It just might drop out a little bit. But it's just kind of, again, just backing off of what Victor's saying, is that will he ever get to this? I've been watching a lot of Zoe B recently, so I've been watching kind of like an English professor's perspective on things. I feel like we're listening to really bad spoken word poetry, where he's saying really fancy things, but I'm not feeling anything.
Well, and part of the problem is that when you talk about actual bigotry or propaganda or ideology, this all operates according to meta narratives that feel good, that don't bother actually interacting with the world in any meaningful sense. And so the seed of goodness that might come out if only we can be, pure and whole and return to a previous era is exactly the way the bigots think when they're being irrational about something, right? So it's kind of it's kind of like literally he showcases his own. Oh, good. Okay, thank God, because this connection is not great right now. He showcases his own way of thinking that leads to his bigotry in the types of language and metaphor that he uses and the kind of word salves that he produces around that, right? The seed of goodness, right?
Yeah.
Which he's borrowing and misrepresenting and cherry picking from Hegel to serve his own agenda, right?
Well, that's the thing. He's not even cherry picking it from Hegel. Like, he hasn't cited Hegel once. Granted, we're only 13 minutes in, but still. I guess we're 15 minutes.
He thinks, but I don't mean he's directly citing. I mean, he's referencing it vaguely as a way of kind of gaining credibility for an unrelated idea, right?
Mm-hmm. Zan, you were about to say something.
It's gone for me already.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we're going to call it here. I am dead tired. I don't know about you guys. So for anybody in the audience, we can all be found at the Cathedral Discord server, which you can see in the description. And in order, would you all like to plug your channels? Victor.
Yeah, sure. So the name of my channel is the name that appears in my little box here is Victor Magariño. And I basically do content on economics, on philosophy, on the mathematics applied to classical political economy. And I do it obviously from a more Marxist, from a more classical political economy perspective. But yeah, I mean, if you're interested, you're welcome here.
And does that?
I'm just going to mention that I don't have a channel yet, but I'm hoping to start one up in the near future. Although I'm very active on the Cathedral, I'm centrally involved in that, and I work a lot with Sunday, and I contribute mainly in the area of analytic phenomenology, social metaphysics, all that kind of stuff. And so I do a lot of work in philosophy. So, look out for me in future, I guess.
Yeah. Actually, Djalma isn't heavily involved in the server. Djalma owns the server. So just to clarify
it's technically my server, and I basically have all of you lovely people involved on my server. So I'm very grateful for that.
And Zan, please.
I'm ZahnZee. I'm an Irish Republican Socialist. It's where I get most of my political positions from. What I do on Twitch is I basically just speedrun games and have interviews with left-leaning people. Do a podcast called Left Thinking. YouTube is just video essay deep dives into concepts, or at least I'm turning it into that. You can find me on Twitter. That's where I'm most active. If just Google ZahnZee and you'll find me. My Twitter is Zan_Z. Somebody got that name way back in like 2008, and not a day goes by that I don't hate them for it. On Discord, you can find me in Djalma's Discord. I can chat there. In the meantime, love chatting. Thank you very much.
No, you too. And just in addition, I keep plugging this everywhere I go. ZahnZee's video on Final Fantasy VII and ideology is actually superb. It's a weird sounding title, but it's actually so good. Check that out. Anyways, thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, for bearing through this with me. And thank you again, he's absent, but to Gregory Sadler for joining us as well. I'm really hoping to get him back in the future.
Yeah. Victor, did you plug? I don't remember.
Yes, I did. The first plug was mine, yeah.
Yeah. And all of the links, all of the channel links can be found in the description, unless I haven't done that, but I think I did. I will if I haven't. All of the channels can be found linked there, as well as the Discord server. Thanks again to everybody.
Thank you.
Not a bother. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And have a good night. Take care. Ciao.
Cheers. Bye-bye.